Creative block. It happens to all of us. Sometimes you can create things, other times you feel like you have no ideas at all. I couldn't tell you the amount of times that's happened to me, but it's a lot. Sometimes I'll want to draw something but no ideas spring to mind. But there are ways of overcoming this, and I'm going to go through them today. These tips aren't universal, so I can't promise that they'll work, but hopefully they'll serve as motivation for somebody. Time for me to start drawing. My first idea is to create a work that actually incorporates the creative block in some form. Drawing from experience is something a lot of artists do, and if you're feeling a bit stuck, then it might be worth having a go at drawing a picture that represents that feeling. This is a type of picture I have drawn in the past. I'm sure a lot of artists and writers would love to have a magic spell book that gets rid of their creative block. Another thing you can do if you want is show the art block representation being destroyed or overcome, and that's something I've decided to draw for this image. The creative block is a literal barrier blocking the line, but a little thing like that isn't going to stop Thomas. Much like the drawings in the last video, I've gone for a style reminiscent of John Kenny's illustrations here. One thing I will say is that whilst the models for the engines in the TV series are explicitly said to have been based on the Dolby illustrations, at least for the first 7 engines, I've always felt that John Kenny's take on Thomas in particular is a pretty close match for his TV series design. I think a lot of this is down to how Kenny's designs for the engines are generally a lot more consistent, whereas Dolby might draw Thomas very proportionate in one drawing, but then might elongate him a little in another illustration, or maybe give him a shorter funnel and dome than usual. John Kenny appears to have used P.R. Wickham's promotional models of the engines for reference. These were known as the locomotive family, and the Thomas model in particular is a pretty close match to how he would eventually look in the show. Regarding this advice to draw a picture relating back to the creative block itself, it's worth noting that this might not necessarily get rid of the block, but you're still combating the block in a way just by drawing a picture. I definitely recommend looking up reference material for inspiration. In fact, I often find that discovering new reference material and broadening your horizons in terms of inspiration can really help you to get your creative juices flowing again. I teased this image on YouTube a few days ago without applying much context. One thing that several commenters pointed out, which I can certainly see, is that the illustration somewhat resembles the scene from Thomas in Trouble, where Thomas has a run-in with an angry policeman. This has given me an idea for a future project, but I mustn't tell you any more, or I shall spoil an upcoming video. But with that said and done, here is the finished drawing. This next idea involves working from a randomly generated prompt. Now, with the mention of generated and prompt in the same sentence, I want to make it clear that I am not talking about generative AI. I wouldn't recommend using AI to generate images or written works, even if you are strapped for ideas, because there's basically no upside. It's bad for the environment, plagiarises the work of actual artists, and it's often fairly easy to tell when AI has been used to generate text or imagery, if you know what to look out for. With all that said, what if you want to draw something, but you're just not sure what? Well, what I've done is gone onto one of those spinning wheel picker websites and used it to determine the subject of this piece. I knew I wanted to draw a train, so my first question was, what type of engine should be at the head of the train? I had the wheel decide between steam, diesel and electric, and I got diesel. After this, I had it decide between a shunter, a small mainline engine, that is to say an engine with 2 4-wheel bogies like a Bobo, or a large mainline engine, basically anything larger than a Bobo. The result was small mainline. I then created this rather confusing wheel to determine a colour. I got grey. Different countries have different designs for their trains and locomotives, and so I decided to pick a country of origin for this engine. I used a pre-made spinner to pick a country because I figured that it would take too long to type out every country name for a custom spinner, and in fact I'd still be typing out the names of countries right now if I'd decided to go that route. Anyhow, the country I got was India, except no it wasn't. It was actually St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but I ran into some problems. So I had to spin again. Now that I had an idea of how the engine would look, I decided to do one final spin of the wheel to choose an environment. I ended up with a woodland area. So that's what I had to draw, a grey Indian Bobo diesel working in the woodlands. The majority of Indian diesel locomotives were actually of a Coco design, but in the end I settled on the Indian Railways class WDP-1. These are a class of passenger diesel engine built during the 1990s, making this far and away the most modern type of engine currently featured in this series of videos. Normally I colour pick from Railway series illustrations, but this time I decided to use a different colour palette. I was keen on the idea of using light shades of turquoise and cyan to depict the hazy background, whilst using lush dark greens for the vegetation in the foreground. Of course the engine is grey as per the prompt, and I've decided to give them some red lining to add a bit of visual flair. The V shape at the front is something seen quite often on Indian locomotives. Since the WDP-1 is a passenger engine, the initials standing for Wide Gauge Diesel Passenger 1, I decided to have the engine pulling a rake of coaches. I wanted these to loosely resemble older Indian coaching stock, although they ended up looking kinda like British Rail Mark III's. Oh well. You don't have to use wheel pickers for just the visual elements of the image. You could use them to determine the character's personality or backstory, although in this case I think I'll draw from real life. The WDP-1s were some of the smallest and lightest diesel engines on the Indian Railways broad gauge. Their job was generally to pull intermediate passenger trains, but perhaps the bigger engines pressured this engine into doing other jobs, believing that their short passenger runs weren't important enough. The grey diesel engine tries pulling bigger and more prestigious trains, but due to the limited power of the WDP-1s, the little engine isn't really cut out for any of them and doesn't enjoy themselves, eventually returning to their intermediate passenger duties, which is where their passion truly lies. The moral of the story being that all jobs are important, and that you shouldn't feel pressured into doing things beyond your capabilities just to impress others. It's definitely been interesting to draw from what is essentially a random prompt. I'm tempted to draw more randomly generated trains like this in future videos, so let me know if that's a series you'd be interested in seeing. With all that said, here is the completed image. My final bit of advice would simply be to write down ideas as they pop into your head. This could happen anytime, but I often find that it generally doesn't happen if you're just sitting in front of a computer screen or a phone or a tablet. At the risk of sounding a bit like a grumpy old geezer, it often helps to spend some time away from the screen if you want to get inspiration. I've noticed that I often get inspiration when I'm riding the bus, or buying groceries, or having a shower. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's where I was when I first decided to make these types of videos. These days, a lot of us have smartphones that we have on our person pretty much all the time. So if you're out and about and a creative idea suddenly flies into your head, you can just open up the Notes app on your phone and make a note of it. Having said that, I do not recommend using a phone in the shower. If you don't have a smartphone, you could buy a notepad to jot down or even sketch out ideas where and when they come to you. Again, I don't recommend doing this in the shower unless you want to end up with a soggy notepad. Best to make a note of your idea once you're finished in there. Of course, that's not to say you can't find inspiration by looking online. It would be hypocritical of me to say otherwise, though there are other times where I just find myself going round in circles, staring blankly at the screen hoping for an idea to fly in through the window tied to a brick. Then at the end of the day I'll have got no work done because I've spent all day waiting for an idea, and I won't even have done anything fun or recreational because I feel too guilty about having not got anything done. In reality, it wouldn't have done any more harm to go for a walk or play a game or watch a film, and maybe an idea would have popped into my head if I'd done any of those things. In this drawing, I've decided to depict James's driver with a notepad and pencil, jotting down some ideas, with James watching with interest. One interesting thing about James's design in the Railway series is the colour of his roof. Throughout the books it switches between red and black. When he first arrives on Sodor he has a black roof because his whole body is black. C. Reginald Dolby then gave him a red roof, but later switched to a black roof. When John Kenny took over, he consistently drew James with a red roof, bar one image where he had a white roof. Gunvor and Peter Edwards would sometimes give him a red roof and sometimes a black one, and Clive Spong was consistent about it, giving him a red roof. James's red roof seems to show up more often than the black one, so I've given James a red roof in this drawing. And so, here is the finished illustration. So there we are. Those are some ways of overcoming creative block. Like I said before, I can't guarantee that these methods will work for everyone, but hopefully this video has proven valuable to some people, and if not, I hope this was at least an entertaining diversion from what I normally put out. I've definitely got some new ideas up my sleeve that were at least partially the result of making this video, so look out for some more interesting videos further down the line. Be sure to subscribe if you're interested.